morning, good morning, good morning, and thank you for joining us again for another edition of Money, Power, and Politics. Enough really is enough. My name is Robert DeShiel, as usual, along with my co-host, Attorney Hassan Barnes. And before you start asking questions, yeah, I'm dressed up today, but I'm dressed up today for a reason because we have a special guest that I'm going to introduce to many of you, and most of you probably already know him, the chairman emeritus of the Harbor Bank of Maryland, my good friend, and in fact, a client, Mr. Joseph Haskins. Now, normally at this point, we would go into the long bio of his time on Wall Street and all that sort of thing, but I'm gonna not do that. Just gonna tell you a couple of stories. Well, first of all, the most interesting thing to me of his background is the fact that he's a fellow alumni of Morgan State University. No, I'm not going to ask him what year he graduated because then I'd accuse you in on the both of our ages. But but I am going to tell you that uh, I don't remember how long ago it was, if it ever was, that my business and personal banking wasn't done at Harbor Bank. As in fact, I've been a customer at Harbor Bank. I was a customer at Harbor Bank before Mr. Haskins even was brought in initially, and that was many, many years ago. Uh, so I have a long and relationship, when I obviously wouldn't have extended for that period of time if I hadn't found it to be mutually beneficial. But anyway, uh, Joe Haskins. Joe Haskins is the longest serving president or chairman of Harbor Bank, and the one who in whose tenure we saw the bank's expansion to several branches that it has now. We saw including I think the newest branch in the Northwood Shopping Center. We've seen the bank expand in the tax credit arena. We've seen the bank expand recently in particularly focusing in community development, with forming its own community development corporation that I'm privileged to represent. We've seen Harbor Bank really become an anchor in our community, and all of this really occurred under Joe's tenure. I think it could be correct. I could be wrong. I think Joe was probably the third president, second or third president of Harbor Bank. Way so too far back for me to remember. I've been practicing law here for 51 years, and the fact is, almost all of that time I was a customer of Harbor Bank. So that tells you some idea of how long the bank has been part of my life and business and the community at large. Hassan Barnes is my co-host, as I said earlier, and I'm going to let him start off since uh, he's the newbie in the
I'm a
group.
newbie. I'm the new guy in the group. Certainly welcome, Mr. Haskell. We don't know each other. I've been a customer at Harbor for years.
Thank you.
For me, it's more about we support black banks, right? If you're a black person, there's no reason in the world why you wouldn't support a black bank. But preparing for the show, I was thinking I have my own views based on my family background, my view of the world. Everyone don't have the same view that I do. In 82, when you guys formed Harbor, there was about 50, 60 black owned banks. Today it's about 25 black owned banks. We've seen a steady reduction in black owned banks and whether there's need for it. I know I thought about black banks recently. I think Bernice King, Dr. King's daughter, started the bank, Redemption Bank. Supposedly the first black owned bank in the West. And the question was, and that she bought a bank in Utah and converted it to a black owned bank. And I was wondering, are there black folks in Utah? Um, is there still a need for black owned banks? And if so, how do we let people know there's still a need for black owned banks?
Uh, Great question. And I want to let you know I'm a little bit of a historian too. And so I like to build history into my explanation.
Mhm.
And we can certainly talk as much in detail as we need to. I want to first go back to sort of what Bob was softly touching in terms of our length of knowledge and relationship and time at Morgan. I'm a 71 graduate econ, and uh, my interest at that time after studying economics is to recognize the importance of understanding how an economic system works. And the aspect of that that captured me was this side of capital and capital access. Um, Sort of as Ken Bob mentioned, I went on to study and go to school in New York. I have a MBA with a focus on finance and capital markets, and worked on Wall Street before returning back to Baltimore. I share that to say that this perspective of business and finance um, sort of came out of a long-term exposure to it, and there was a group organizing or attempting to organize the bank who had not been successful, and I was a part of the change of the organizing group that actually helped bring it to fruition. Again, one of the people, Bob, that you know very well, that was a real supporter and mentor was Ray Haysbert,
Yeah, right.
who asked me to step in. And so part of my role was actually getting the bank formed with all of the appropriate processes. And that fit my need because I was in the investment arena at the time and saw that we needed to have an institution that was sensitive to our community. In the late 60s and 70s, if we look back, we'll find that there was limited access to banking and financial institutions for people of color and other minority groups, such as the Hispanic community, the Asian community, et cetera. As well as there was limited access to even small white business operators. Interestingly enough, there were five major banks in Baltimore that were dominant. Three of the heads of those banks all had graduated out of private schools, out of Gilman, and had sort of a close network. So if you, again, were a part of that network, you were in good shape. If you weren't, you were sort of left out. And so for me, I saw a need that existed that we needed to address. And three areas stood out that pointed out a real dearth of access and resources. One, small business financing. Two, mortgages for people of color, not based on limited ability to pay, but limited access. And thirdly, support of nonprofits, and in particular the faith-based community. I cite that to be able to bring you forward to answer the question. The question of are minority banks, in particular Black-owned banks, still relevant today? The question and my response is absolutely yes. Access to capital today is still very limited in terms of our communities, both in the banking arena as well as in the private sector. If we look at access to capital through private equity funds and private credit funds, if you sort of did a deep analysis, you'll find that less than 1.5 to 2% gets into the hands of Blacks. So I'll give you one other statistic that speaks to the relevance. There are roughly about 4,000 commercial institutions across the country. What is interesting is that 80 to 90% of them are community banks. Community banks are the real catalyst that brings change and economic resources into a community. And that's what Black-owned banks have done and have been to the various communities. Uh, I'll pause there because I know there's a second part to your question, which is why do we have this drop off in numbers? So if you want me to pause or continue on, I'll stop, but I can tell you why that has occurred.
Well, no, one, tell us why it's occurred, but when you mentioned for the audience who may not be as steeped in banking, community banks and the role of black banks, which by and large I see black banks as community banks, typically in the black community, but community banks do play a huge part in development. If you can tell the guests what community banks are, and then go into the drop off and the number of black banks.
Community banks are really developed as a need of individual communities. Again, creating access to financial resources that are vital to developing. And so a community bank in Iowa is probably ag-related, agriculture. So to support farmers, et cetera. And so we can look at where these banks are formed, and you'll see that they have a particular focus on the business or the industry there. So you can have those that focus on agriculture, those that focus in livestock financing, et cetera, those that focus on different kind of resources based on where they're located. Um, so when we talk about um, urban communities, urban communities often have very different needs from what we find in rural communities. And I use that agriculture reference because that's sort of a rural kind of a need. If we went to West Virginia, it would have been institutions serving sort of the mining side of the house and et cetera. So with a specific focus. In the urban communities, and in particular where we had a need for financing of housing, and we know about redlining. So if you weren't in a certain community, your access to a mortgage was limited. And so nothing to do with your ability to pay and afford, but given what that particular business, that particular bank was looking at in terms of the way it was measuring. So in simple definition, community banks were formed to support the needs of their community. Many of the old savings banks kind of blossomed following the wars as you had returning veterans and they created home mortgages. And so we used to have banks named after the communities. If we look at Baltimore, the Irving Banks, the Rosedale Federals, et cetera. So we can see that those banks identified with the communities that they were providing resources. Again, we didn't have that in a Black-owned institution, which is why the need for a Black bank community needed to happen and needed to evolve. Now, the question is why there's a drop off. The interesting thing, and a lot has been written about this, following, the Civil War, the Freedom Bank was established under Freedom Bureau in 1865. That often gets associated with the first Black-owned bank, but it really wasn't a Black-owned bank. It was actually managed and overseen by whites. It only lasted 9 years and it failed. And it kind of, and the reason I cite that because it created in the community a skepticism about the ability and the quality of management of a Black-owned bank. And so, unfortunately, it got tainted by the lack of proper management oversight and to some extent corruption of the white leadership. And stories get passed on, through generations. So over the period of time, there were other banks, the first black-owned bank really was formed in like 1888 or somewhere, give or take a little bit down there around that time. And so these institutions, unfortunately, would come and go. And so it was always a question about the quality of leadership. So we see that failure.
Mhm.
And so the question is why? And even if you think about this, the FDIC and the insurance really didn't come until the 1930s. And so there was no backstop
Mhm.
for depositors. So you put your money in at your own risk
Yeah,
and
but
peril.
yeah.
Yep. And so, so that kind of hung over this whole industry in terms of black banks, whether we had adequate knowledge and ownership, proper, et cetera. So at the high point in the 70s, we got up to the 50, 60 black owned banks. And as we watch what occurred, many of those institutions tried to fill gaps and needs that were present in the community. Here's the challenge that often occurs. Um, at the end of the day, you really can't violate the canons of lending and banking. Um, the appropriate analysis has to take place. The appropriate due diligence has to take place. The numbers doesn't follow ethnicity, doesn't follow. It follows it. So when you find somebody who's operating with a 620 credit score, there's a difference between somebody who has a 720 credit score. That credit score is reflecting something, whether the person is a good person or not, it's reflecting that there is probably a delinquency in repaying, some defaults that have occurred, and et cetera. So what am I getting at? So what has happened in several of these communities out of a real genuine interest by many of the institutions to really try to step up to meet the needs in their respective communities, they overreached. And by overreaching, they exposed themselves to risks that couldn't be covered. Our country goes through its cycles. We know so much about the Great Depression of 29, but if we talk about since Harvard was formed in 82, there have been three recessions. Um, and if we look at these recessions, I like one of the sayings by Warren Buffett. He says, when the tide goes out, we know who's swimming naked. And that's what happened in these cycles. Each one of those cycles took out several of the black-owned banks. Not that it eliminated their need, it simply took them out. And when we look back at what occurred, even with the S&L crisis, we talk about the number of black-owned banks that went under. But if we look at the 80s and early 90s, you probably had a reduction, even in this Baltimore community, about 50% of the savings and loans went under because of how they had tried to filter into the commercial banking space without adequate knowledge and understanding. And so, unfortunately, our institutions trying to overreach, overprovide, overserve, overextended themselves, and as a result, the casualties occurred. I'm going to give you one other little piece of uh, what isn't said, and again, this gets to the economics that we talked about. If we remember several years back, Killer Mike spoke about, supporting black-owned banks and made this major call and so forth. Well, uh, we in the banking community saw this major sort of surge in terms of the population coming in
Mhm.
to want to do. Well, they were coming in opening $5 accounts, $10 accounts, $100 accounts, etc. What is unknown and not reported, and I want to be careful here because the spirit of it was right, the economics was not. Because the average account, depending on the period that you look at, because technology has entered, but that period of time to open that 10, even $100 account on an annualized basis, it's going to probably cost you 150 to 200. So quietly, several of us had to
Yeah.
curb that to avoid the economic fallout that was going to occur because you were creating a built-in losing proposition
Mhm.
that would only eat at your bottom line.
I think, and so I remember that when Killer Mike talked about black banks, I think people misconstrued what he was saying. They came in just to have an account versus doing their banking there on a regular basis, right? Versus having direct deposit at the accounts versus opening businesses there. They wanted to say, okay, we have a black bank. I'll pay $5 to $10 to here, and I support. I think what he was saying was, no, we need black banks as actual whole thing, not as and that part got missed. So I think you're right in that. And after that call, it kind of faded by the wayside. I see Bob have a question. Before you jump in, Bob, my other question to you is, I guess the follow up to that is, you're right. Savings and loans have gone by the wayside. A lot of young people don't even know they existed at this point. So when you said it triggered my brain. A lot of the black banks have gone by the wayside, and many of the young people don't recognize that there are separate banks. They don't know Harbor to be a black bank. They know it's a bank down the street. And if you're in Randallstown, you may see one of the branches, and you may drive past it. In terms of the deposit and the need for a black bank, what I get as an attorney, my clients always try to find ways to get capital, whether it's they get loans to support a development, and their concern is that black banks should be for businesses or for people who have equal. Like, so if you have a white person with 720 credit score and a black person with 720 credit score, their fear is at the bigger banks they don't get the same loans. So they go to Bank of America, they go to Wells Fargo, they go to Chase, they wouldn't get the same loan as the construction company who only has 720 credit score, have the same revenue, the $1.5 million per year in revenue. They don't get the same treatment and same support, and they think black banks should make up that difference, and they haven't seen that to be the case.
I would tell you that my experience has been that the statistics and the profile that you define, I think Harbor has been able to meet that on an equal, if not better, basis. Um, and I can tell you at one point, um, Harbor, if we go back, say, 20, 25 years ago, um, we used to have a half to two-thirds of the judges who would congregate in the center of Harbor's Fayette Street office to decide where to go to lunch because they were all doing business with the with the bank. And I can share with you that any number of the law firms that were operating, especially the black owned ones, had business relationships, and we went out of our way to do that. Many of the developers would come to us, and we would do that. And so uh, I think that oftentimes what happens in the process is when you get someone who didn't really qualify or didn't really have what was required would make a statement, well, they're no better than the other institution, et cetera. Um, Bob, talked about my time around, and one of the things that I did I was big in education, and so um, the faith-based community was really aggressive, and I actually coordinated several meetings going back even to Kurt Smoke, where we would congregate the other banks to have them open up their coffers to lending to Black-owned churches. At one point, Harbor had done numerically, in terms of number of faith-based organizations, more than any other bank. Now, they may have had larger ones, but we had done more. I probably have done, over my tenure, probably 1,000 different kinds of faith-based loans.
Mhm.
Uh, but I can tell you this, I remember speaking at one of the churches, I won't call out the name, they had a minister's um, focus on providing access to capital and mortgages in particular to men. And so they had this men's ministry as they defined it. And there must have been on this Wednesday or Thursday night, in attendance, some 75 to 100 men at this particular church. And I went in to speak. And so we started talking about it. And I got the comments that you were just sharing about why we made more loans. And I had this negative experience. So I said, well, let's take a moment and let's go through this. Let me ask you, how many of you are employed in the church? I just started that simple, and maybe 3/4 of them raised their hand that they were employed. So, so that other, quarter really couldn't be bankable. Then I said, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about credit scores. I said, how many of you have either a default on your credit score, you're not paid, or payments over 90 days? Believe it or not, almost 3/4 of the folks said that they had one of those going. So, to make a long story short here, when I asked how many people had credit scores of 700 out of this number, I may have gotten 10 hands out of that number. So I said to them, and the questions began to rise, and this is why education is important. They said, well, someone said, well, yeah, but I went back and uh, I paid down on the amount, so they still had me owing $2,000, and I paid them down to 100. I said, but you haven't paid it all off. I said, so we can't just look past that. Or someone said that, well, uh, yeah, I'm paying late, but they're getting their money. Well, 90 days is, you see what I'm saying? So, in many cases, what is often said, one thing gets reported on the application. When you do the checking, then something else surfaces. So again, and this is part of the discipline that I brought, and why is Harbor still around? Because I brought that discipline in, and so I may love you, and Bob knows of one or two people that I'm very fond of, and I had to take a hard line with them because they didn't qualify, because those are the things that take us out. It's more important for us to be around. I'll tell you one thing that I set up. I was having so much trouble with folks who want to call themselves developers or who were home improvement, that we set up my nonprofit CDC. And in that, we have a developers program to teach those who are in that arena, which you know about, how to go about doing repairs, et cetera. Because what they didn't realize, once they put their money in, real estate is illiquid until there's a transaction. But your obligations to me, they are there.
Yep.
And so what we did was we went through this educational piece so that we could have people understand how to do it. And then those are the ones that we look at doing deals with. So we've tried to address some of that, but yes, there are those who have not received all of the benefits, but I can tell you it's more based on what's not shared and seen
Yeah.
than what is.
I want to, all that you said is true, and obviously I've experienced all of it and continue to experience it on a daily basis. Um, I want to unpack some of what you said because there's a lot in it. Going to one of the core principles is the idea of a credit score.
Mhm.
I don't know, and I don't know whether anybody knows how uh, how Experian or the other the other two agencies. I don't know what formula, what algorithm they actually use to arrive at that number. And I think that's a closely guarded secret. I don't think they disclose that. And I and why do you think it is that the credit industry is so limited? Why is it that those three companies, and maybe historically there've been more, why have I mean, at some point it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. I
Mhm.
mean, uh, why has anyone, has the industry, the banking industry, the credit industry, has anybody taken a good hard look at that question? The question of why, if whether there's something else that could be relied upon rather than a credit score that's determined in a way that really is undisclosed. And let me follow up with I've always considered it an anomaly that the party who is determined to be the most risky in terms of, for whatever reason, is charged the most money with if an accommodation is made. Higher interest rate is what I mean, which seems to me to I understand the logic. With more risk, therefore we should get a greater return. But the higher interest rate seems to be a factor which promotes the failure, if there is to be one. So it seems to be upside down in that respect. And let me get it all out. Let me get it all out. If there are laws which prohibit uh, discrimination against black folk by the non-black owned banks, if I assume it, and I'm not naive enough to assume this to be true, but if those laws were enforced so that the credit decisions that Hassan talked about cannot be made on the basis of race, religion, national origin, sex, then what would your answer then be as to the continued necessity for a black owned bank, in as much as the principles that you outlined have to apply across the board to every institution? You have to demonstrate some ability to repay the loan. You have to demonstrate sufficient uh, uh, recovery basis if for whatever reason you don't repay the loan. Those are cardinal principles. Whether you're talking about the economy of Harlem in the 1920s when Bumpy Johnson was the banker, or you're talking about the economy today, ability to repay and something to soften the blow, if you will, in the form of collateral if you don't. those principles haven't changed. So I stopped there.
You have created a very complex question with different aspects.
Yeah, I know it's compounded, and,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
if I was in a
yeah.
courtroom, there would have been an objection. It would have been sustained.
Well, and oftentimes the banker is left as the judge and the jury.
Yeah.
And so, but let me try going back to sort of the unpacking aspect of this. I don't want to at one moment deny the existence of racial biases that have become institutionalized and not totally um, expunged or removed because they are present. I will say that because banks are regulated organizations,
Mhm.
again, you think about the FDIC, the comfort that you all have in having more than uh, at least $250,000 or any amount of money is that in the event of a major economic crisis and that institution goes under, you can expect to get your check.
It's a backstop. Yeah.
It's your backstop.
Yeah.
So because of that, that regulatory body has its set of guidelines, criteria that have to be met. If they aren't met, they have several different categories that they can define your institution. The highest rating can be a 1. If the lowest is a 5, but if you're 5, you're just waiting for somebody to come in and take
Right,
your keys.
Right.
Okay.
Right,
So
right.
so that's the reality of where. So in between that is a certain amount of operating requirements have to be met. They're going to look at what they call in terms of their internal a Camel's ratio, which deals with capital, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, and sensitivity to interest rates. So I've got to make sure that I have our institution complying in that.
Mm.
So capital ensures that there is a certain amount of security. I'm not supposed to tell you what that is because that's confidential information. And I've been called down by on one or two of these kind of talks when I try to give more information. But capital is one.
Mm.
Asset quality goes to the loans and et cetera. So they come in and do their own assessment.
Mhm.
So if they happen to look at Mr. Barnes and say, well, Mr. Barnes hadn't paid you in 90 days, we have a set of guidelines to say that you got to start reserving against the fact that he looks like there could be a credit risk coming down the track. After you get to another level, we are expected to start charging it off. Oh, well, now what happens to that? That hits two areas. It hits my capital, which gets diminished. It hits my earnings. My earnings is what reinforces or builds my capital.
Mm.
So then the question comes to management. Well, Mr. Manager or Mr. Head of your organization, our requirements are this, this, and this. You aren't covering this appropriately. You aren't covering that appropriately, et cetera. Now, Mr. Manager, we're questioning whether or not your institution should continue to receive our insurance coverage. Now, think about this. So, the minute I lose insurance coverage, then what happens to my credibility as a viable institution? And no matter how much you may like me, Bob, and we can go to Morgan's homecoming and celebrate, but you aren't going to put so much money there because at the end of the day, I like to tell a little story if you got a couple minutes. So my mother, when I was in the bank, called me and said, she said, son, I'm hearing that you're really not loaning enough money in the community. And one of my dear friends was saying, that they had come to you and they qualified and you didn't lend them any money. And she said, son, you weren't raised that way. And I said, no, mom. I said, I agree with you. And so she said, but I want you to do something about that. I said, well, mom, I can do something quickly. I said, mom, you have a little bit of money in the bank of deposits. And so I said, mom, I tell you what, I said, if you let me take an assignment of your money, I can loan your friend that amount of money that they need. And she said, well, why would you be loaning my money? I said, because that's what I'm doing. I said, the money I loan is money deposited from other individuals. I said, but you want to help this person, but you can be directly a help. She said, well, what does that mean, son? I said, well, it means that until that person repays me, you don't have access to those funds. She said, but I put it in there. You got to give me money. I said, no, but you're helping out this. She's so I said, but yeah, but mom, but I can help that person right away because I want to do what you want me to do. She said, so I can't get my money when I want it. So she paused and then she said, son, keep doing what you're doing. So when you personalize
change
it,
the equation,
it,
how you think about it differently. Yeah.
it changes the equation. And so I have this fiduciary responsibility. So Bob, you don't want to come down to the bank and after you've done some work. And I said, well, I don't have any money to pay you. So then you see the cycle, and that's the part of the economics that you have to be conscious about is that all you're doing really with the bank is managing risk.
Mhm.
How you deploy the resources in a way that it can be returned with enough profits that allows you to continue to do it again. And so, but I don't want to say that there isn't a built-in certain amount of institutional racism that many of us are challenging. One of the things that I'm working with the new dean at Morgan is to have his people, rather than just sitting talking about what's in books, but to do research and come up with white papers that began to identify and point out some of these aspects that can be challenging and so forth. So there is, to your point, a need to be more investigations. But while you're doing that, you've got to operate within the parameters that will keep you compliant and keep you viable as an operating entity.
And is it true that in some situations what may appear to be discriminatory based upon the race of the parties involved may in fact be relationship? In other words, if I know you, even if I got the same principles, but if I know you, I might try harder to find a way to make the deal work for you than if I don't know you. It isn't it the case, for example, in housing, this notion of segregate, oh, not segregation. Let's use that as a concept because banks are part of the community. The banks are not living, breathing things. They're people who work in a particular institution. So the fact that I live in a community and deal with the people that I live with or know growing up differently than the people who live across town that I've never come into contact with doesn't mean, and I treat them differently, doesn't mean it's because they are of a different race. It could very well mean that I just don't know them. And I think, and so this this push to end desegregation, for example, and I'm going to go off kilter just a little bit. Because I'm going to get in education you talked about. I'm going to get the Brown Free Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, which has been heralded from a legal point of view as foundational in terms of the elimination of racial bias and racial discrimination. I think it helped to destroy, and let me put it another way. I think it helped to promote the idea, the rumor, the myth that Black institutions were inferior by nature.
Mhm.
The fact that because there were times, during Reconstruction when Black banks, hospitals, insurance companies were profitable, and those who thought that that was an anomaly sometimes white folk reacted violently at bombing in Tulsa. So, but what's your reaction to? What's your response to my opinion that as well intended as as Marshall was and Greenberg perhaps at the Legal Defense Fund, as well intended as they were in trying to create the opportunity for Black people to have equal access to education, that they gave up the baby along with the bath by, by embedding across the board in educational institutions and otherwise that if it was Black, it was necessarily inferior, and in order to eliminate that, you had to destroy what was natural relationships that had nothing to do with color. It just simply had to do with who you knew. And I'm rambling here, but you getting any sense of the question I'm trying to get at?
Absolutely. And again, from this historical perspective, one of the reasons that this country profited to the extent and became the international economic sort of powerhouse that it is because it had a free and non-expense associated with its workforce, i.e. slavery. And there's many books that have been written on that and et cetera. Cotton is king. Cotton really was the major proponent to that. And actually, when you drill down enough on it, you'll see that more of the Civil War was around economics than it was just that. It was because the North didn't have their benefit as a manufacturing base to compete against the South, who had this employment base that cost them nothing, and the amount of wealth accreting there and so forth. So economics has played a role. So when we look at the historical aspect of it, for somebody to be primary or be number one, somebody else has to be secondary and junior.
Right.
And so it was to the economic advantage of the majority white community to keep sort of an underclass.
Right.
And so African Americans have felt that sting and tinge just across the board in every sector. And the unfortunate part, which is more subtle in your analysis, is that we bought into it from an African American perspective, where those lighter complexion saw themselves as more privileged than those of darker hue.
Yep.
I mean, so all of that filtered in to the process. And then it filtered into education, those with more education being superior to those with lesser education. And we can see that through all as a part of this sort of larger design by the white majority community to keep themselves in a power controlling role. So the fairer skinned Blacks could be sort of the caretakers for helping to bridge the gap between that and so forth. I mean, so the subtleties of
yeah.
it, yeah, of all of this is very present. And so part of what I'm after now, which is what the Jewish community learned and Southern ethnic groups learned, when you amass enough wealth, you're at the table. And the decision making, there's no question about, if I can contemporize our discussion, why the US is having so much interaction and taking so much input from Israel.
Mhm.
There's a wealth component that is very prominent. If you look at some of the major wealth accumulated here in this country, it's accumulated in our community.
Mhm.
You can't dismiss that as having an impact.
Mhm.
The other piece that people don't talk about and don't see is the relationship with the Arab community. And it is interesting if you look at the amount or lack of condemnation that has come as a result of their indiscretions. But we can trace back and see where members of the Bush family early on had investments, and it's all the way through to this administration. So part of my point is economics is going to drive so much of what happens and outcomes. What I am concerned about, and the reason going back to the need for Black-owned banks,
Mm.
is because while we haven't scaled to the level that we should be at, we are still existing and we still are resourced to a certain amount of capital. What our focus has to be on is how do you help a harbor scale to the next level, and those 20 to 22 remaining ones, how do we scale those to the next level so that we have, and this is not a selfish and overly idealistic moment. We've got to create more wealth in the African American space. We can't be concerned about whether our cousin, our brother becomes the next millionaire, this, and then be critical if they were industrious to get there, et cetera. What we want to do is create enough, and hopefully that we've created enough wealth that we're sitting at the table. So when this 500 $1 million worth of fees that were going to happen with SpaceX get paid out, that some percentage of that goes into the Black community. I will guarantee you that less than 0.1% of those fees that will get paid out will end up in the hands of anybody of color. I will also be willing to wager that of the 400 or 500 folks who will be made millionaires, that less than 1% of those will be people of color.
Yeah.
So as long as we keep allowing this wealth gap to happen here, you don't have to be discriminatory. The financial resources will discriminate and isolate and categorize just by virtue of numbers.
And I'm gonna tell a story, but your conversation almost leads me inevitably to a discussion of the concept of, some people call it reparation, I call it restitution. Uh, and the way, how do you stop the bleeding, if you will? One way, you can't, if you allow that accumulated wealth to be passed on to generations unborn. So because but the earlier comment about the how the caste system it became part of our. I remember being in school. It was, if you're yellow, you're mellow. If you're brown, stick around. If you're black, get back, or something to that effect. And our former good friend and also a client of mine, you mentioned his name earlier, Ray Haysbert. I can recall vividly how it is that Park Sausage came to be a client of mine. In fact, it didn't happen until Ray found out that Willard Hackerman at Whiting and Turner. It hired me, and then so we continue to have the problem within our community of our embracing of the principle that white folks ice is cold. We still believe that. In fact, I used to say, and sometimes will say now, that if the good Lord thought, for whatever reason, to eliminate white folks, you know, even for a day, 60 or 70% of black people would commit suicide by the next day. So, but bringing this discussion to, as you say, contemporize it today, we are now living, I think, in a political time when the head of state and all of his minions and sycophants following his lead, and I'm not sure he's the one who designed it, but nevertheless, in every way that I can think of, it literally declared war on black people. How does a black bank continue to, does that cause you to change anything in terms of how you go about serving that community, either from a consumer or commercial point of view? How do black banks and another front, we see that a bank that purports to be the largest black-owned bank in the country, One United, has grown up. I don't know much about them, but they purport to be the largest black-owned bank in the country. If that's true, if it's not true, it doesn't matter. But if it's true, how were they able to achieve that at a time when existing community banks such as Harbor and others small, whether it's Industrial Bank in DC, if it's still open, I guess, have not been able to experience a similar, what appears to be exponential growth?
One, probably the largest black-owned bank today is probably Liberty, which has cost $1 billion, and it's done so by assembling several Southern banks that were in some state of concern. One United is probably in second to third position in terms of its size. What occurred during the process is that we had the Great Recession was a major. However, we were on a great growth trajectory during the previous pre-Great Recession period. And with the Great Recession kicked in, it really put a cloud over, and it really sort of stifled the growth of all of the institutions. The regulatory agency stepped in a way that they forced write-downs, write-offs, et cetera. So many had to pause their activities, and Harvard was one. We had to work through that period. During my tenure, I'd never had a loss, never had a not well recorded institution. The Great Recession was for me a big challenge, because what it did was it exposed that there could be circumstances beyond your control, because it became international, et cetera. So we worked through that and building back. The big benefit that was realized by many of our institutions is actually what came out of the different stimulus programs that were done to help address the COVID crisis.
Mhm.
And so it put us in a position to have an opportunity to build because several of the institutions that did move to the next level, they were able to, because of some problem banks in close proximity to them and branches of other majority banks, they were able to pick those up.
Yeah.
And that's what aided
Okay.
in their growth and exploration. But when you look at how Harbor's performed, the uniqueness of Harbor is not just the bank. Harbor is really a financial services institution. You spoke about, our CDC, which does this developer program, which is unique in a bank. I also have what's known as a CDE, Community Development Entity, where we do new market tax credits. We are nationally recognized as one of the top 10 institutions in that production, and that includes the major banks. So here you have this little Peaks Creek Bank that has raised just under $750 million that has leveraged about $4.5 to $5 billion worth of development across the country. That entity is unique in terms of a community bank. And then we set up back in 2017, a private equity group, Harbor Capital Corporation, which does a combination of mezzanine lending all the way through to equity investment. In fact, one of the projects that we were invested in is the Enolia, which is the student housing project that's done by Morgan.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that has allowed us to do is not only just realize profits from a prospect of spread where we take in money, loan it out, but it allows us to participate in the ongoing business enterprise. And this is why I talk about this importance of access to capital. We really got to think about access to capital in terms of how we're going to challenge some of those older limiting aspects that come as a result of caste, racial biases, come as a result of all of these other aspects, because some of it really is about how do I keep me and mine in power and in control.
Right.
And so when you have amassed a certain amount of wealth and you have worked out the taxing that allows a large part to pass on to generations, then you're ensuring a leadership posture of those in the future. It's not by coincidence that if we look at the current president and his family members, while they're simultaneously assaulting many of the programs that could enhance African American economic progress, they, as a family, are creating unbelievable wealth that will become generational.
Right.
We've got to be mindful of that and not get distracted with all of these other kind of issues that we spend a lot of time talking about. I agree that our democracy may be under assault and all that sort of thing, but we got to say, how do we ensure that even if we move taxing earnings, like you got a whole set of profits that virtually get not taxed, carried interest. I mean, these dollars just sort of amass in numbers, or money that's earned. If you keep your money in over a certain period of time, you'll pay it at a capital gains tax, which is at 20% when somebody else is paying at 30% for the same amount. So we got to focus on those aspects that exist that are wealth creators for one segment of the population at the expense of another one, because any tax amount that is beneficial from a reduction standpoint is a cost to those
who got to pay the bill.
who got to pay the bill.
Right.
And that part,
The-
people don't. Jump in real quick, Bob. People don't see that part, the pay the bill part. I wanted to address before we wrap up. One of the points you made is about wealth and about certain communities having more wealth. Forbes puts out a list every year about billionaires, and a couple years ago I saw it, and the report identified black billionaires between 20 and 25 black billionaires. Not African American black. So whether you're in America,
Yeah,
you're in
yeah,
Brazil, you're in Caribbean, you're in Africa,
yeah.
it's about between 20 and 25 billionaires. And there's so few of them, we know their names, we as if they are relatives. Whereas other communities, people have hundreds of billionaires in much, 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 much smaller communities. It seems to me as a cultural thing, blacks writ large, doesn't don't mean American, haven't focused on building wealth the same kind of ways that other communities have, and we haven't seen the need for it. As Harbor is trying to grow, and Bob mentioned One United, there's Liberty, there's a bunch of other black banks that are. I think Liberty has what over $1 billion in on assets.
Yeah,
One United has 700 something on
yes,
million on
yeah.
assets. Harbor has about 400 million on assets. What's the plan going forward to build Harbor from the 400 to the 800 to the $1 billion asset limit?
A couple of things. One, uh, you have to have an organic growth, which means that you're building from your community, et cetera, which is why I'm sitting here today to talk about some of the things we're talking about and to encourage other African Americans to look at Harbor not as a second choice, but as a first choice, because we're doing more than the others are doing. And we got to, again, change those mindsets, those perceptions, Bob, that you and I just talked about. I believe in fact, this notion is that because I can have an account at JP Morgan Chase, I feel better than having it at Harbor, not thinking about the fact that the same coverage levels exist at Harbor, et cetera.
Yeah.
But I can, from an identity standpoint, say that I'm this. So we got to change these mindsets. So that's one initiative. The other initiative is to look at where there are strategic purchase opportunities, because we started doing that before Great Recession, and I purchased some Carrollton branches. The interesting thing that occurred then, again, because that population, when we look back 20 plus years ago, largely that population were those whites who had grown up in the 50s, 60s. So they had the mindset that whites are superior to African Americans, et cetera. And so we would buy a facility, and then half of the deposits would leave,
Yeah.
et cetera. So we have to buy. Now, fortunately, there is this millennial and younger group who don't see race quite the same way. And so we can tap in to some of that. But here's the point. I can, if with these other entities, I have earned more in 18 years with the CDE, which does new market tax credit. I've earned more with that, with technically 3 people, than I've earned in a bank in 44 years.
Yeah.
So my point is, again, looking at how we strategically build, because it's not about size necessarily, it's about how you cash in on what is sizable. And that's what I'm trying to help focus on, which is why I bring the SpaceX piece in, because you got 5 institutions that are going to probably be splitting at least $400 million
Just in fees.
in fees.
Yeah.
I mean, just splitting them. And so so partners will be walking away with 10 and $20 million, et cetera. And so that goes into their family coffers, that will go into family funds and so forth and so on. And so my point is that we've got to be building these same kind of structures. So what do I do with the stock that I have in Harbor? I want to build that so that it passes on. I don't need to spend all of my money with a new pair, $400 sneakers, or doing this, because one, you can only wear so many. You don't need all of it. And then we get caught up in the materialism rather than so what I'm about is education. How do we build economic wealth in the African American space, because when you control a certain amount of wealth, you can control the kind of institutions, the kind of programs that you know that are going to be beneficial to your community.
Do you see, and the good thing is we control our own time here.
Okay.
But my goal in life is to end the subserviency that we all have to a time clock.
Okay.
That's my goal. So
Good luck.
As customers come to you, particularly business customers I'm talking about, I, we do you see this team approach? Do you see the we? In other words, that you mentioned 4 or 5 different disciplines that will profit from SpaceX when it goes. When a black business comes to you, do you see them supported by a black insurance agent, by a black accountant, by a black lawyer, by a black real estate broker? Do you see, or is it coming in with the I attitude, and trying to impress you with people from other communities as to establish credibility, so to speak?
Let me approach that from this perspective. I can tell you that what I tried to do at Harbor and what Harbor has been instrumental in is being catalytic. And what I have forced, you may recall, I headed EBDI. In fact, working with, going back to O'Malley, I said, he wanted me to get involved. I said, if I'm involved, I want to control. I set up a operation where we purposely identify African Americans in each one of the categories. And so, so when you look back, at that time, Mike Brown was brought in as the attorney. Initially, it was scheduled to be all white attorneys. He had his firm. I said, I changed that. And actually, several of the white attorneys who were used had to send their bills through him. So I did that. I had black accountants who participated in. I had African American constructions. If you go back to Kevin Johnson is now in commercial real estate because what I did was I forced Tinsel Phelps to do a partnership with him to bring him in to do 855 Wolf Street, et cetera. So we were catalytic in doing it. Now back to our alma mater. I worked with the Jewish folks who control that. If you remember, that shopping center fell to a certain just deplorable state of existence, where at one point it had gotten down to just one tenant, which was a liquor store and et cetera. And so I talked with Dr. Wilson early on about we need to do something about it. Well, part of when I talked about the New Markets tax credits, which has a real incentive, I was able through using tax credits to bring $5 million worth of equity into doing it. But we did it, and if you look at who really was responsible, we have Frank Bramble as the David Bramble as the developer. I had Kevin Johnson as the construction person, et cetera. So largely that got done by people of color. So what we tried to do, we being Harbor, is to bring in different folks of color in these major projects. Now, I can tell you that even in doing that, we still have to educate even those who we bring in, because they will bring in other whites. I know that's why I wanted to come back.
Okay.
So that's why I want to parse this a little bit to say even there, because as well as I love David, et cetera, David had to go through, and David and I have gone through our educational piece, and I've sat with David at one breakfast piece because he had a concern about whether or not African Americans got the bigger picture and was surprised that blah, 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 blah. And so so there's been the education, and even as I brought going way back um, to doing state center. I brought Kevin into that when a problem developed with well, Streamer Brothers, but the other
Oh, yeah.
the black
I know you're talking.
yeah. So so that there's still this tendency when there is a talent need to go to the other community, which is one of the, again, educational pieces we got to have. But the other part, though, about that we've got to be conscious about, we got to be developing the next generation in terms of who's going to be the successor.
Mhm.
I'm actually writing a piece on that now about succession planning because one of the issues that we have really experienced, and I'll have to come back at a later point on your podcast to talk about what I've done as a research. People don't realize that between 1950 and 2000, that we had 10 different companies that made BET's top 100, and we had two of the companies to be in the top 10 during that period of time, and yet they don't exist today.
In fact, BET is not even black owned today.
Yeah. But I'm saying, but
Yeah, I got it.
so we are, even when we build something successful, people don't realize G&M Oil, by the way, in 1982 was at 63 million, was number 7 on the BET list, and on that same year, Jackson Oil was number 10 at 52 billion. They don't exist today. Why not? So I'm saying that while we might want to be critical of what has been happening institutionally with all of the biases and the other factors that we've already discussed, there is some responsibility that we've got to accept in terms of us ensuring that we are making the right efforts to prepare the successor generation, because there's no way you're going to amass the kind of wealth that's going to be needed if you got to start from ground zero every time.
That's true. And I'm gonna close with this. Maybe if we go on. The difficulty in succession planning is that, in my estimation, we've been raised that we've accept the fact that white folks ice is colder, that what white folks have to offer is better than anything anybody black could offer, and so we've raised a generation of children whose goal is not to take over dad's business, whose goal is to go and get a good job or a good position with a white company. We've raised kids that way. And I'll say this, we're the only group of people that I know, that I ever know, who got our children up in the morning, got them to brush their teeth, wash under their arms, give them a cold sandwich or whatever, pack them up, put them on buses to go get stoned. Wonder why they didn't love us.
Mhm.
Money, power, and politics. We certainly are going to keep an open invitation to my friends. It's a wealth of knowledge, and see if we can get involved in all kinds of discussions. But I think it's beneficial because it's informational, and we need to know our history. Because when Joe's generation and my generation are no longer here, who's going to tell it? Who's going to tell it? So Joe has an open invitation. Mr. Haskins has an open invitation to come back anytime he wants. I'm going to invite him again. So if he's not going to come, he might as well say no now. But thank you for tuning in. On behalf of my co-host, attorney Hassan Barnes, the inevitable chair of Harbor Bank, and I certainly learned a lot. I think you did too, if you're listening and understand. We'll see you next Friday, Juneteenth. It is. Money, power, and politics. Enough really is enough. Thank you for tuning in.
Take care,
Thank
guys.
you.